This tank chat is going to be about this vehicle here, the Sd.Kfz 251, really the first majorly successful armoured personnel carrier that has led to all those APCs we see in operation today.
Please remember to like, subscribe or click the little notification bell if you don't want to miss out on these videos. And I'd just like to say thank you to all our patrons for making this possible. Please join them if you can.
First World War, Britain invents the tank. It's to lead the infantry across the battlefield, crush wire, allow the infantry following on behind to get in German trenches, and hopefully that was called the break-in, and then break out the other side to carry on manoeuvring, perhaps with the cavalry going through the gap. But even before the end of the First World War, Britain had come up with the Mark 9 vehicle, which the design there, the intention was put 30 soldiers inside that vehicle and carry them forward with the tanks so they have a form of protection. So you might call this the first armoured personnel carrier. Now, all those experiments were stopped at the end of the First World War with the idea that we probably aren't going to need that again in the future at all. But in the 20s and 30s, people are looking at how forces will be using mechanisation, military vehicles, armoured vehicles, trucks, etc., how they might be used on future conflicts and battlefields. One of the ideas that comes up again is, how do you send infantry with the tank if you're going to want that? Or should you do it other ways? Should you actually have one tank for each individual soldier? And in the 20s and 30s, different countries tried different types of vehicles, again with tanks in various combinations. Now, most of those vehicles end up being trucks to start with, but the French have the Congress half-track vehicle. Alphonse Congress, he's worked with the Tsar of Russia, out in Russia before the Tsar's deposed. He comes back to France, he works with Citroën, and he comes up with a half-track vehicle. And the advantage that's seen with those half-track vehicles, especially the Congress runs, and they're sold to a number of different countries, is the fact that they've got off-road mobility as well as being faster and quieter on roads, and they tend to have, the front wheels to be steered, the back two track systems as well gives them that sense of being able to spread out the weight of the vehicle, gives them better traction over cross-country. So a number of countries experiment with this. Crossley Congress, it's actually, a Congress vehicle is actually sold to America in 1930, and that begins the American experiments with half-tracks as well. Germany's already looked at the half-track principle even during the First World War, and Germany develops in the mid-1930s a series of half-track vehicles that they're going to use as what they call prime movers. They're going to be using them for towing things like heavy artillery, lighter artillery, and they do them in a series of different sizes. And these become very sophisticated, state-of-the-art half-track vehicles, but they're done for a very specific purpose, not to be made necessarily into armoured personnel carriers. Now, Guderian in 1931, he puts forward the idea that we are going to need motorised infantry, preferably in an armoured vehicle with firepower, to accompany the panzers into battle, with the panzer divisions or the fast troops, these units that they're trying to put together, with this idea that you will want motorised infantry going hand in glove with tanks to help each other on the battlefield, as well as certain other types of vehicles as well, such as bridging and certain other things, engineer variants, to help that force be able to independently progress forward. Guderian's ideas, they're taken up obviously by the German military in 1933, the Nazis come to power, but the problem is, for finding a vehicle that's going to be suitable for the German infantry to go in and to accompany the tanks, there is just not the industrial capacity in Germany at this time to actually start building them up on their own. And in the end, it's the tanks that are getting the priority there, first of all, for building. So that's why some of these prime movers are looked at. And in 1938, the Sd.Kfz 11, which is a small, medium-sized half-track vehicle, soft skin at this stage, designed to tow the 105 howitzer, that vehicle's looked at with a view, can we do an interim solution, some form of bodge, as it were, that we can put armour plate on it? Would that work to make a half-track vehicle? 1938, they do the first testings at Kummersdorf. 1939, some of these vehicles for the first time go into service with the German military. Now, the two companies used, Hanomag is one of the companies that's actually puts together the chassis. That is then armour plated by Busing NAG, the company that comes up with this very angular shape. This shape, by the way, of how you're going to use your armour protection has been in service with the Germans from their very early armoured cars. They're very much aware that you end up increasing the distance or the thickness of the metal a horizontally approaching bullet is going through by angling the plate. And they end up using about 8mm armour plate on the vehicle with a view that, again, angled 8mm, normally about vertically, will stop a standard bullet. Angling it, you're going to be able to start stopping armour-piercing bullets, etc. And they put a front plate at the very front here, two angles on the early models of about 14.5mm. So with this Sd.Kfz 11, this 3-ton tractor vehicle that is put into service in 1938, they look at that as vehicle as an ideal sort of size and capacity for converting into an armoured personnel carrier. It can tow about 2.7 tonnes worth. It can carry about 1.5 tonnes worth of load in the standard vehicle. So they put 8mm plate on most of the body. Just the front plate, they put a thicker 14.5mm, and the early models have a couple of plates coming together in the middle there. So it's got enough protection to stop bullets, shell fragments, etc., but it's not going to be very heavily armoured. That's one of the key points there. It still keeps its lighter weight and its mobility. Now, a variety of manufacturers start putting these vehicles into production from 1939 onwards. Adler, Auto Union, Skoda. In Czechoslovakia, again, vehicles are made. This particular one here behind me, this one here is actually made in Czechoslovakia in about 1941. And they're given, as soon as production ramps up, they are given the SS classification, which means that they are prime vehicles in top notch. These are the ones that we want first. This is priority SS classifications given to that. So they know they want these and they want them in numbers. There's not that many of them have been issued by the time that the Germans are going into Poland in 1939. The early models of those, as with all German vehicles when they're changing Ausführung, A and B models just have really very small changes on the side. They're made in a few hundred of each model. They're just where the vision ports on the side are changed, a little bit difference with stowage. Ausführung C is then made from 1940 to about 1943. This is a C model we have here. And one of the key identifiers of that is instead of 2 bits of armour plate on this front, as I've mentioned before, you've now got one major 14.5mm plate on the very front there. Now these vehicles, they're called Schützenpanzerwagen. The key role is that armoured personnel carrier. So 10 soldiers being able to go in the back, commander and a driver on the front. The driver, as you're facing the vehicle, is on the right-hand side. That's their primary role. It's given a petrol engine. It's a Maybach HL42, which gives it about 100 brake horsepower in there. It can get up to about 33 miles an hour on the open road. It's got a gearbox that gives it about 8 forward and 2 reverse gears are definitely in there. And it's a very mobile vehicle. That advantage, what they're doing there with the advantage of the tracks are long. So a lot of the vehicle, compare this to things like American half-tracks, etc. The tracks on a 251 are much longer. They take up much more of the body, and most of the weight is above the tracks that way, and that gives them that sense of traction on the ground. There is no power going to those front 2 wheels. They are only there for steering. All the power is going through the engine back to the tracks and engaging with the tracks on the rear there. So that power, rear, not the front, the 2 wheels at the front are just to try and help it steer. Now inside there, because of the configuration of the armour, the steering wheel is actually cut backwards going under the dashboard in front of you. So when you turn that wheel, 15 degrees either side will turn these, and it will just engage the front wheels to help you turn. Anything over that and linkages then go through to the brakes that are part of the track system, and you'll be driving then and steering like a tank does. In other words, you're braking the track on one side, the other side keeps going, and it will take you around the corner that way. So you can, and you'll see in photographs, you can lose a front wheel, etc. It is not that important to the steering or the driving of the vehicle. It just, again, obviously, if you're going down a slope or heading forward, having a wheel on the front and not just digging in is going to be quite important that way, but not essential for keeping the vehicle going the whole time. On the sides, those tracks, you've got 6 pairs of staggered dual road wheels. They're pressed steel ones with rubber around the outside. It's that interleave suspension system that's been come up with by Niekamp in the 1930s, used on a number of German vehicles. It's to spread the weight across the track in a quite an intense area by doubling up those wheels there and interleaving them. The downside, as you've probably read around the place, is off you're at the eastern front, snow, ice, mud, if it gets in there and it freezes up, it can block, it can actually jam those tracks together that way, which becomes a bit of a problem. The tracks themselves, they're made up of small cast shoes into which goes a rubber pad, but the technology here, which again in the mid-1930s seemed to be a good way for me going, it's got what they call needle roller bearings, and these roller bearings on each of the tracks where the pin goes through, that pin is secured by a little split pin at the end, but they have to be lubricated on a regular basis. And of course that means maintenance of this vehicle suddenly goes up. They're not a dry pin, they are needing lubrication. Slack track, but it's going to pick up all the time that it's driving around, it's going to pick up dust and muck, etc. So that lubrication, if we're not careful, that can end up leading to a pace that then wears out the joints quite quickly. But the whole idea of the rubber pads, it keeps the noise on roads down. The other side of it, they did try taking them off because they're running out of synthetics and rubbers to be able to put on here. They do try metal track at one point, just pure metal track, but they went back to rubber afterwards because they realised it was too noisy and it was creating too much vibration on the vehicle. Now the suspension on these tracks is torsion bar, and they're paired up, 2 pairs of torsion bar going across the vehicle, transversely across the vehicle. And those torsion bars, again, they're sprung, so it's got a good mobility on the back there. The problem they've got is when they're pairing, it means that actually they're slightly offset. So one side of the track, on the left side, as you're facing forward, it's actually got 56 links in it. On the right side, it's only got 55 links in it. So because, again, that cambering of where those torsion bars are going across the bottom of the vehicle. In 1943, a new version of the vehicle is put into production, the Alstrom C, and that vehicle is designed very much to simplify production. The sides of the vehicle, the stowage is flatter, and you can very easily see a C version of the vehicle. You can tell it by the rear doors. Instead of coming out at the back, they're actually angled undercut. They go straight down at the rear there. And that vehicle goes to be produced right to the end of the war until they start running out of materials. But you'll see these vehicles, there they are in Berlin in 1945. They think about 15,500 are actually made during the war, and that makes it the most numerous armoured vehicle that the Germans make in World War II. So, you know, this is a large production, a lot of effort goes into these vehicles, and they cost around about 22,500 Reichsmark each, and that's about the quarter of the price of something like a Panzer III at about just over 100,000 Reichsmark. So they're still expensive vehicles. They're high quality engineering in there, even though, as I say, ironically, they're a little bit of a sort of compromise. They tend to carry, in terms of weaponry for the vehicle that's going to be going into action, as just the standard 251. They call that the /1, to carry 10 men into action. The normal standard armoured personnel carrier, that would normally have an MG34 or later a 42 behind an armoured shield at the front, another on a different mount at the rear, and sometimes a third would be being carried by the section that could use it if they dismount as well. But one of the things about this vehicle, even though the 251/1, that armoured personnel, the Schützenpanzerwagen version is the key version, it is made in an awful lot of other variants. So they think about 23 different variants of this vehicle are actually built. So we end up with things like the 251/2, which carries a mortar, 251/4, which tows a howitzer behind it, 251/3 is a radio version, 251/8 is this version. This is the version that they call the Krankenpanzerwagen, or it's an ambulance. And there's two versions of this. 251/8/1 actually carries a FUG 5 radio as well. And some of these vehicles are ones that have been converted from earlier 251/1s, the armoured personnel carrier variant. Now, when you're an ambulance version, which this one is, you could have a combination. You could either have 4 stretchers suspended either side in the back, or 2 stretchers and seats on one side. You could carry up to 8 seated wounded if you had to that way. And some of them they actually took out on the rear. There's a flatter area at the very back above the doors. They took some of that out as well to help the loading of stretchers in that rear area. So that's another one of the smaller conversion that goes on here. They put a large container for water on the side of the vehicle for the ambulance with a tap that goes through. And we've got the hole, you can see it, the container's not there anymore. And that leads through into the main part. So again, so that they can, well, especially with this vehicle, because it was out in the desert, you've actually got a ready water supply for the wounded soldiers there, carrying it around the place. Now, in terms of combat, it's got weapons. Various weapons are put on, up to a 7.5 gun in these different models. The problem it's got is an open top. And for plunging fire, hand grenades, etc., that means you're not protected. You'll see some of these, sometimes they'd have something called a canvas tilt that would be put on arches over the top there, just to keep out the weather. But there is that, you could argue that's one of the greater weaknesses of this. So airburst weapons, the soldiers inside are exposed. But it is used tactically very cleverly. The idea behind this is what you're going to be doing is going forward with the tanks, normally in 3 waves. First wave is just the tanks. Second wave are tanks and these 251s accompanying the tanks. And they use the 251, they use it sometimes as calling it like the eyes of the tanks. They've got much better visibility because of that open top. And they're reporting on the radio to the tanks where there's targets. They are mopping up infantry as they're going forward. And they can also debus the infantry section if needed to finish off pockets of opposition on foot. Normally 3 waves, the last wave would also take SPVs and tanks with them, normally about 150, 200 metres apart as they're working their way forward. And the Germans, when they do analysis of the use of these in battles, one of the things they come up with is where these 251s are being used, infantry casualties go down in the attack. So it's proving its worth to the German military, hence that SS designation. They want more of them going in there. Now for the Germans, they managed to make enough of these vehicles so that by the summer of 1942, every rifle regiment in any of the panzer divisions now is fully equipped with these. And that's also the time that they then change the names for those units and call them Panzer Grenadiers. So all of those units that are now fighting in these within an armoured or a fast unit, they are now being called Panzer Grenadiers from the summer of 42 onwards, and that's where that phrase comes in. It sees further use after World War II. Some armies, they repurpose them, but in Czechoslovakia, the key one, 1958 to 1962, they put them back into production. This time with a Tatra diesel engine in and with an armoured roof on the back. And they actually saw service right the way through till 1995. So they've been in service quite a long time that way. So the Schützenpanzerwagen, it's a compromise vehicle, but it's a very successful vehicle for the Germans in the Second World War. And even though it's not the very first armoured personnel carrier, it's the first one that's built in large quantities, used by the Germans with their Panzer Division, that idea of the lightning war that they were doing in the early years of the war. So it's become embedded as almost a symbol of those German forces. And it really does lead to all those post-war APCs and how we're going to use them with motorised infantry under some form of protection with some firepower accompanying tanks into battle. And that, of course, is still going on to this very day.